So the root of the all questions in the Israeli-Arab conflict, its war against Hamas, everything really, if you boil it down, it comes down to the issue of whether the Jews and Israel committed some kind of original sin in 1948, where they came in, these foreign colonial Jews from a land far away, and usurped the Arabs. And ever since, they've just been justifiably resisting. And their cause is just, and free Palestine from the river to the sea from these horrible, controlling foreign Jews. That's been the narrative. And for too long, I think people in the pro-Israel camp and people that claim to say, oh, I support Israel, whatever, they aren't prepared to really tackle this issue head on. Perhaps also because they think maybe there's a bit of legitimacy to their grievance. Maybe there is something that we are in fact guilty of. But I've been saying now for a while that we need to understand quite clearly whether this is a legitimate grievance or whether it's actually an ideological hatred at the root of this. And it really boils down to one or the other, in my view. And the more we indulge in it's a bit of this and a bit of that, the more Israel's going to, and peace is going to be far away, and the more Israel's going to find itself in trouble. It was this way of thinking that led to them leaving Gaza, led to them making all kinds of tactical errors. And so for me, this gets to the very heart of the issue. And so I was so delighted. It may seem a bit weird to say that because it's such a dark topic, but my mum actually introduced me to Professor David Stone, who we have joined today, who's come up with a new book called Antisemitism in the Arab-Israeli Conflict, Time to Confront the Elephant in the Room. And it is, and I've got it with me here actually, it's a really important read because until we understand this, until we understand that ideological hatred is at the heart of this, you're never going to be able to solve a problem. And that's precisely why Professor Stone is so interesting, because he took the approach from a scientific perspective. He actually has a background in science. And in science, you have to first diagnose and then you try and cure the problem. So, Professor Stone, thank you for joining us on JTV. I wondered if you could start off by, given you have a background in science, can you tell us what was it that led you down this path of diving deep into analysing the Israeli-Arab conflict?
It's a question I'm often asked, Ollie, and it's one that I've asked myself actually many times since this book was published. And I framed the question a rather different way, which is what took me so long. I've been aware of the central role of anti-Semitism, actually of genocidal anti-Semitism, in both starting this conflict, I'm going back now over 100 years, and sustaining the conflict. And I'm not the first to have noticed that. Many people have been very well aware of that, including Israeli leaders. And yet, we all resist that narrative. It's not a narrative, actually, it's reality. We'll come back to this issue of narratives later on, I think. But we all have a tendency to resist it. And I often ask myself, why is that? Why are we so resistant to looking at something that is staring us in the face? That's why I use the metaphor of the elephant in the room. It's staring us in the face,
Yeah.
but we don't want to stare back at it.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is it's a deeply unpleasant experience. It generates all kinds of atavistic and unpleasant memories about our experience as Jews, both historically in the diaspora and today in Israel, and indeed in terms of the global reaction to Israel. So, as human beings, we naturally seek to distance ourselves from things that make us feel uncomfortable. And this subject of anti-Semitism makes us feel uncomfortable. Actually, it makes everybody feel uncomfortable, Jews and non-Jews. So it's understandable in a way that we would rather find another explanation for what is going on here. And many of us, and I include myself in this, I've embraced the narrative that it's fundamentally a territorial dispute between two groups of people who can't agree where to draw the border.
Mm.
That's the narrative that is promoted in the media by such distinguished personalities as the BBC's international editor, when he tries to explain to his global audience, which is a huge audience, what is the essence of the conflict. It's a conflict over territory between two groups of people, and both of them see it as a zero-sum game. There's only room for them, there's no room for the other.
Mm.
And for a long time, I felt there was something deficient about this narrative, because when I looked at reality and when I considered my own experience of living in Israel, I lived in Israel for a number of years, talking to Israelis, and above all, self-educating about the conflict, I came to the conclusion that that narrative was not only deficient or partial or selective, it simply wasn't true. And I decided, well, I must find a book about the role of anti-Semitism in the conflict. It's such an obvious topic to write about. And I couldn't find one. I couldn't believe that I couldn't find one. I obviously thought I hadn't searched hard enough. So I searched again. I still couldn't find one. I found quite a lot of articles on the subject. I found within historical texts, and there are lots of histories of the Arab-Israeli conflict, I found within those books references to anti-Semitism, but it was downplayed. It was either mentioned in passing or emphasized in terms of what I would call an epiphenomenon. It was something associated with the conflict, but not its underlying driving force. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Somebody has got to address this. If nobody else is going to do it, I'll have to do it. I'm not a historian. I'm not a political scientist. But as you said, I do come from a scientific background. I come from an epidemiological and public health background. And what we do in epidemiology, the very first thing that we do, in the past, I used to have to explain to people what epidemiology was, but since the pandemic, that's not really been necessary. Everybody's heard of epidemiology. What we do is we make a population diagnosis. We try to identify the frequency of a particular disease in the population. We describe that in terms of incidence and prevalence. And then we try to use that as the starting point for investigating the causes of that disease in the population. So it's very much evidence-based. And if somebody comes up with a diagnosis that looks wrong, we challenge it. And if it turns out that the diagnosis is wrong, then most reasonable people will change their minds and apply a new diagnostic label. In terms of of a political phenomenon like the Arab-Israeli conflict, I find that people are not willing to change their minds. Once a narrative is imprinted within somebody's psyche, it's very difficult to get them to remove it, even when they are presented with contrary evidence. So that's why I felt it was really important to write about this and to apply my, not so much my epidemiological framework, but my scientific approach to problem solving to this conflict. Now, I'm not claiming that I can solve the conflict or end the conflict, but what I can do is call out the wrong turn that has been taken for many, many decades in assuming it's just a matter of getting Israelis and Arabs, or more specifically Israelis and Palestinians, to elect leaders or appoint leaders that are prepared to make the necessary compromises to live together on that narrow strip of land. And it turns out that that narrative, which is accepted by, I would suggest, 99% of the world's population amongst those who are interested, the narrative is simply wrong. In other words, the diagnosis is wrong. And because the
Yes.
diagnosis is wrong, the interventions are wrong, because the
Yeah.
interventions are predicated on a wrong diagnosis. And just as if a doctor makes the wrong diagnosis in a patient, the treatment is far less likely to work. And I believe that's why the conflict has lasted over 100 years, because we've got the diagnosis wrong. And
Yeah.
that's essentially my motivation for writing this book.
Absolutely. And there's so much that I want to talk about in terms of the implications of this and the psychology of this, that people stick to narratives that are so false. It's funny, when I say these points that it's ideological hatred that lies at the root of this, whatever, and people sometimes say that's just such an extreme point of view to have, and that's you're not acknowledging the other side. And I actually think that it is a form of extremism to keep indulging in the nonsense that it's just a land dispute and that it's legitimate grievances driving this, and they're calling for we just need a two-state solution and that's the cause, and needs to tone down its aggression. That actually, to me, is a form of extremism where people keep on insisting on something that doesn't reflect reality. So before we talk about all the psychological aspects of this, why don't we just dive into, if you could summarize from your book, obviously people need to actually get a copy of it to get the meat of it, but could you attempt to summarize for us with maybe some examples, the findings of your book?
Sure. So the first thing I did was I looked very carefully at all the historical evidence I could gather to try to make the correct diagnosis, if you like, a geopolitical diagnosis. And I looked at the history of the conflict, and I discovered that however far back I went, I had to go further. So it wasn't enough to go back to 1948. I had to go back to the origins of Zionism and the opposition that was generated to Zionism, not initially within the Arab world, I should emphasize that. In 1919, Chaim Weizmann, the head of the World Zionist Organization, signed an agreement with the head of the Arab world. Or actually, he was the heir apparent. His name was Prince Faisal, and he was the son of King Hussein of Mecca, who was the leader of the Arab world at that time. And his son, Prince Faisal, signed this agreement with Chaim Weizmann. I talk about this in the book, in the presence of a British character called T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. Many people will know him by. Highly intelligent man, probably sympathetic to Zionism, although we're not entirely sure about that. He was known as an Arabist, but sympathetic to Zionism. And indeed, so was Prince Faisal sympathetic to Zionism. He actually wrote a letter to an American Zionist saying, "We will give the Jews a warm welcome home." So when that agreement was signed, there was huge hope around the world, both in the Arab world, in the Jewish world, and in the wider international community, that there was going to be no problem about re-establishing a Jewish state, what they called at that time a Jewish national home. That was the words of the Balfour Declaration that was incorporated into the League of Nations mandate to Great Britain. Unfortunately, within weeks of signing that agreement with Weizmann, Faisal walked away from it. We don't know for sure why, and I won't go into the details. You can read about it in the book. But for whatever reason, he walked away from it, and so we were back to square one. And it's such a tragedy, because if that agreement had held, and let me just remind people who may not know, what that agreement said was that both leaders mutually recognized the right of the other to self-determination. The Arabs would have a state, a very large state, incidentally, taking up most of the territory of the former Ottoman Empire that had collapsed after World War I. And the Jews would have a small state, roughly equivalent to the territory that became the Palestine Mandate. Actually, it was on both sides of the River Jordan, but even within west of the River Jordan, there could have been a Jewish state at that time. So that didn't hold, and as a result of that, the scene was set for a conflict. Now, it needn't have been a conflict. It needn't have been a violent conflict, because in 1920, the principal Allied powers, the powers that had won, were on the winning side of the First World War. They issued a declaration at San Remo, which is often called the San Remo Resolution or the San Remo Declaration. Out of that declaration came the British Mandate and a number of other mandates in the Middle East and elsewhere. And out of that resolution emerged 22 Arab states, many of which were established long before Israel was established. And at that time, there was no real Arab opposition to Zionism, interestingly enough. at the time of the declaration, but there was something going on in the background that the senior diplomats had not noticed or were willing to ignore. And that was a new radical Arab leadership, strongly influenced by the growing movement of Arab nationalism and injected with a particularly fundamentalist form of Islam that today we call Islamism. And the leader of this group was called Haj Amin al-Husseini, who in 1920, actually it was on Pesach or Easter of 1920, instigated rioting in Jerusalem and the Galilee region of Israel, what is today Israel, instigated violent rioting against Jews. Most of those Jews at that time that were victims of the attacks, the pogroms, if you like, weren't even Zionists. They were Haredi Jews. They were ultra-Orthodox Jews. They weren't particularly interested in Zionism. They just wanted to be in Eretz Yisrael to pray for the Mashiach to come. They weren't political in any way. And they certainly hadn't organized themselves defensively. So they were sitting ducks for this kind of terrorism. This was essentially the first terrorism that the region, that the area of today's Israel and the Palestinian areas had experienced. Now, why did Haj Amin launch that pogrom in 1920? He knew that the principal Allied powers were meeting at San Remo, and he had heard through his contacts there was likely to be a declaration endorsing the Balfour Declaration of a few years earlier, in 1917, and possibly even going further than that, which in fact they did, because Balfour didn't talk about the reconstitution of a Jewish national home, but the mandate did, that was included within the San Remo resolution. So he wanted to forestall, he wanted to preempt any attempt to establish Jewish statehood in the region. And as a result of that, the Arab-Jewish conflict ignited. And we can go into some aspects of that later on, but most people will know that tragically that conflict has continued for the past 104 years, and is still raging today as we read in our news every day. So the question is, what is the diagnosis here? The diagnosis here is that extreme, radical, violent anti-Semitism as epitomized by the leadership of Husseini, a figure who incidentally is still idolized by the Palestinian elite today. And the international community has indulged that radicalized, genocidal anti-Semitism to this day. Of course, they don't say so explicitly, but implicitly they have, through their continued support for anti-Semitic leaders, such as, unfortunately, I hesitate to say this because it's unpleasant to hear, the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. He is an anti-Semite. There is ample evidence that he is an anti-Semite. The international community does not call him to account for that racism. And we had something that struck me actually just before I started writing this book. On the 70th, I think it was the 70th or 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, a ceremony was held at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, memorializing the tragedy of the Holocaust. And one world leader after another stood up and gave wonderful speeches, which essentially ended with the phrase, "never again." After they made their speeches, that was in the morning, in the afternoon, they all beat a path to the door of the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, and embraced him, all of them. And I'm thinking, this doesn't make any sense. On the one hand, we're hearing them denounce the horrors of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, expressing the view that this must never happen again, and then embracing an Arab leader who epitomizes the continuation of that tradition of anti-Semitism, as if the warm words they had uttered in the morning had never happened. So that was one of the motivating factors. But to come back, I have to come back, but this is such a complex subject that I find it's very easy to go down byways and become diverted from your question, Ollie. So to come back to the summary of the book, the diagnosis that we have to face, we've got to be realistic about this. However, we might be repelled by it. The underlying cause and sustaining driver of the conflict is genocidal anti-Semitism. That's number one. Number two, the conflict will not end unless we acknowledge that that is the diagnosis. That is the root of the problem. And number three, if the conflict doesn't end, we're all at risk. When I ask, who do I mean by we are all at risk? And by that, the words I use the words very carefully. I mean we are all at risk. Jews are at risk. Arabs are at risk. Everybody in the international community at risk. That may sound absurd to some people, but if we look at the reality of the people who are promoting, the extremist groups who are continuing to promote this genocidal anti-Semitic ideology, they have been quite explicit about this. Their interest is not only in destroying Israel and killing Israelis. They want to kill all Jews. And once they've killed all Jews, they will then turn their attention to the wider Western world that they loathe. I mean, it wasn't a coincidence that the Hamas terrorists on October the 7th of last year couldn't resist attacking the Nova party in southern Israel on that morning. It's widely believed, I've heard this reported in the Israeli media, although it's not been absolutely confirmed, but it's widely believed that they jumped the gun. They weren't supposed to attack on October the 7th. It was supposed to be at least 24 hours later, possibly even later than that. And it was supposed to be a coordinated attack by Hamas, Hezbollah, and other Iranian proxies. But the Hamas leadership could not resist the temptation, first of all, of attacking an easy target, but secondly, attacking a target that represented to them a symbol of all that is wrong in the world. Young people, scantily dressed as they would see it, enjoying themselves, dancing together, and celebrating the kind of occasion that is absolute anathema to these Islamist groups, to these jihadist groups. And I think that represents, if you like, that horrific morning represents the kind of hatred that is directed fundamentally at Israelis and Jews, but also at the Western way of life that they have their sights set on, as well as a long-term objective. So we are all at risk if we don't recognize this. And that is what the book is about. The book is not addressed exclusively to Jews or Israelis. Far from it. The book is addressed to every decent human being on the planet that is willing to look at the evidence, not listen to my narrative. It's not my opinion. It's not a pro-Israeli view. It's not a piece of hasbara. It's an evidence-based, almost clinical diagnosis, which I would rather not have made. But that is the essence of the conflict. We have to face it, or we're going to bequeath to future generations at least another 100 years of conflict.
So, what would you say to someone that says, well, hold on one second, we saw this Arab hostility, al-Husseini, all of that, but that only emerged once there was murmurings and plannings of creating a Jewish state. So, we didn't see as much Arab hostility towards Jews prior to that. So doesn't that prove that it's actually not anti-Semitism? It's just hostility to Jewish sovereignty in a land that they think they've been there for a very long time and should have the governing rights to. And so that's what it's about. What would you say to that?
Yes, and that is part of the anti-Israel narrative, of course, that there was just peace and love was prevalent across the region, across the Middle East, until Israel was established. And those Israelis, those evil Israelis, destroyed it all by ethnically cleansing the land of Palestinians and imposing their rule on an area that was not theirs. Now, we know that there are so many lies there that it would take the rest of this interview to unpack them. But all we need to do is again look at the evidence. What was the background to the establishment of Israel? What was it like for Jews living in Muslim lands before that period? In fact, before Herzl wrote his pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, before the establishment of the Zionist, modern political Zionism. And we know, and there have been many historical accounts of this, that the position of Jews in Arab countries and in Muslim countries was precarious prior to the establishment of Israel. It's true that it wasn't as dire as in Europe, in Christian Europe, which had a long history of anti-Semitism, as we know, going back to the very early years of Christianity. It wasn't as bad as that. And that we know how that led to pogroms and ghettoization and ultimately to the Shoah and to the rise of Nazism and the final solution. So that let's put that to one side, that argument. We acknowledge that the position of Jews was not as bad as their position in Europe. Nevertheless, from the very early years of Islam, Jews were regarded as what they called dhimmis, or so-called protected peoples. Now, in reality, they weren't protected at all. They were given a higher status than they were in Europe, but nevertheless, they were second-class citizens. There was all kind of legislation that discriminated against Jews, and indeed there were periodic outbursts of violence that led to the massacre of Jews in numerous places around the Middle East. This is all well documented. And again, for those who are willing to open their eyes and look at the evidence, there's no argument to be had about that. And that is why so many of today's Israelis adopt a relatively hard line against their Arab neighbors, and they're relatively hawkish. Why should that be? They're not intrinsically hawkish. It's because of generations of their own familial experiences living in the Arab world, because more than half of Israelis today are Sfaradim. They come from the Middle East and North Africa, and they have very bitter memories about their own lives there and how they were peremptorily kicked out of their homes and deprived of their assets. They weren't able to take money out. They weren't able to gain any compensation for the property they left behind. And they're very bitter about that. Even though they themselves spoke Arabic, many of them, most of them actually, had Muslim friends, recognized that in some ways life was pretty good for the long period of time, centuries that Jews lived in these Arab lands, but nevertheless they knew the reality. They were able to make the diagnosis correctly that there was a long-term Muslim antipathy to Jews that has just been erased from history. In all of the conventional narratives about the Arab-Israeli conflict, you won't hear this subject discussed.
Mm.
You might hear connections made with European anti-Semitism, because that fits the narrative of some kind of colonialist Jewish movement from Europe entering the Middle East, depriving the Palestinians of their rights and establishing a state illegitimately. That fits the narrative.
Yeah.
In other words, the Palestinian refugees are regarded as the victims of the victims, to use Edward Said's words. That's a very glib phrase, and
Yes.
actually it's attractive to people, but it's
Yeah.
entirely ahistorical.
So,
It didn't
so
happen.
can you just briefly tackle that, the biggest myth of all head on, this notion of Jews, Israelis ethnically cleansing the Arabs in 48?
Yes, it's so wide, it's so often repeated that it's become one of these bits of accepted knowledge that people think they know when actually they're being misled.
Mm.
It's quite true that during the first war between Arabs and Israelis, what Israelis call the War of Independence, between 1947 and 1949, there was a lot of violence on both sides. and refugee populations were created on both sides. And there was a tendency within Israel to feel uncomfortable about this subject, perhaps quite understandably. It wasn't addressed properly. There were no really authoritative historical accounts in the first few years of the state. But it was generally felt that somehow whatever the Israeli forces had done was somehow justified because Israel had been attacked. First of all, in November 1947, after the UN partition resolution had been passed by the General Assembly, that was the start of the civil war. And secondly, when the newly declared state was attacked on the 15th of May 1948 by 7 Arab armies, whatever the Israelis had done to defend themselves, including some unpleasant things, such as expelling Arabs, was justified in the context. So they didn't really want to go there. They felt uncomfortable about it. Things changed when a new generation of historians came along that we tend to call, we use the label the new historians or revisionist historians, that said, hold on a second, we've got to face this charge of ethnic cleansing. We've got to recognize that perhaps we were guilty of ethnic cleansing after all. And we wouldn't be alone in world history if that had been the case. And one of the foremost of these revisionist historians, and there are still plenty of them around today, still spewing anti-Israeli propaganda, because that's what it is, as you'll hear from what I'm about to say. One of those was a historian called Benny Morris, who worked at the same university as I worked in, Ben Gurion University of the Negev. He adopted the view that yes, it looks as if the evidence does suggest there was large-scale, what we would today call ethnic cleansing of Arabs from the territory that would become Israel during that war. But then something very interesting happened. After the 50-year rule whereby British mandatory documents were released for research purposes, for scholars to examine, to look at some of the events that happened around the time of the end of the mandate and the start of Israel, Benny Morris, being a good historian, decided to look at the evidence. And he said, here we've got fantastic documentary evidence from, if not impartial bystanders, from the British authorities, who were certainly not pro-Zionist. All the evidence suggests they were more pro-Arab than pro-Jewish, but nevertheless, let's look at what they had to say happened. And Morris said, when I looked at the evidence, I changed my mind. Do you know, that's a very crucial point. That's a crucial insight. How do you know if somebody is truly evidence-based in their approach to this issue or any other issue, if they're prepared to change their minds? I changed my mind. I changed my mind about the two-state solution, which we perhaps will come on to. I changed my mind. I don't think I'd suddenly become a bad person or suddenly become anti-Arab. I changed my mind because I looked at the evidence. Benny Morris changed his mind because he looked at the evidence. And he meticulously documented all the alleged massacres on both sides during that War of Independence. And he came to the conclusion that yes, a minority of Arabs had been expelled by Israeli forces, by the embryonic IDF, but the vast majority, well over 80%, had fled out of fear because there was a war. There are always refugees in wars. We've seen Israeli refugees in this current war since October of last year, and we've seen plenty of Lebanese refugees fleeing their homes currently. It doesn't mean there's a deliberate policy of ethnic cleansing. If you and your family if you find yourself in a situation where you're afraid for your safety, you leave. And that's what happened to the majority of Palestinian refugees. On top of that, many of their own leaders told them to leave, and we've got documentary evidence about that, because they said it's only going to be temporary. We will be victorious against the Jews, and you'll be able to return to your homes very quickly. Of course, that didn't happen, as we know. So anybody who wants to look at the evidence relating to this charge of ethnic cleansing should read Benny Morris's book called 1948, the most recent edition, because he updated it in the light of new and emerging evidence. And I think it's an extremely powerful testimony to the reality of the situation, that the Palestinian refugees were caused by the war, that their own Arab leaders instigated, first of all locally and then internationally, and that those Arabs who were ejected from their homes and expelled by Israeli forces, and there were some, represented a small minority of the total. And so that myth of ethnic cleansing was exposed and should be
Yeah.
widely known about, but unfortunately it isn't.
Yeah, and Mossab Hassan Youssef, the son of a Hamas co-founder and leader, spoke recently about how his own grandmother told him that this happened, that the Arab leadership told her to leave in 48. Remarkable. One other critique, chart. I don't even understand this. I find it so bizarre. But you have some people in the anti-Israel camp saying, how can Arabs, or how can I be anti-Semitic when Arabs are Semites? I find that so bizarre, because even if Arabs and Jews are both considered Semites, the point is anti-Semitism is just a term we've come to use to talk about Jew hatred. So we're just talking about Jew hatred. Why are you getting stuck up on semantics? But I wondered if you could, because you mentioned that briefly in one of your chapters, could you just briefly summarize that point?
Yes, that is correct. You do often hear that argument that the Arabs can't be anti-Semites because they are Semites. And the
So
truth of the matter is, that anti-Semitism, as you say, has always referred to hatred of Jews. It was actually coined by an anti-Semite, Wilhelm Marr, in the
yeah.
19th century. And he wanted to find a respectable sounding term for what he presumably really deep down knew was a form of racism.
Hmm.
And so the term anti-Semitism became current. Actually, a lot of writers in this area are arguing today we should abandon the term anti-Semitism. It's not helpful anymore, first of all, because it's twisted and distorted in the way you've described. But
Hmm.
secondly, it kind of sanitizes the phenomenon. It gives it a kind of respectable veneer, anti-Semitism. I remember towards the end of my academic tenure at Glasgow University, having colleagues telling me that anti-Semitism was perfectly understandable and reasonable. First of all, because of the actions of Israel, and secondly, because the Jews killed Christ. Believe it or not, that deicide charge was leveled at me to my face. So I wondered, if that's what they see to my face, what are they seeing
Wow.
behind my back? Which
Wow.
is one of the
Wow.
reasons. It's one of the reasons I took early retirement. I couldn't. It was bad for my mental health to be
Wow. Wow.
continuing to work in that environment. So
Wow.
a lot of writers have said we should use the term Jew hatred. Let's call a spade a spade.
Hmm.
It's horrible, it's crude, it's in your face, but it's accurate. It's Jew hatred. And the term anti Semitism, a lot of people don't know what it means.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when they don't know what it means, they can be manipulated by propagandists for anti Semitic purposes, which is what has
Yeah.
happened. And so that essentially is how that came about.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I wondered if you'd agree with me, having studied this in depth now, that I think the two-state solution is inherently problematic in its very DNA. And the reason for that is because I think that, well, some people say, yeah, but if we can de-radicalize the Arab population, then it could work. But I think the reason why it's inherently a problem is that the two-state solution is telling them, feeding their fantasy of getting rid of the Jewish state, of the notion that the Jews, if you push them enough, they'll give up more and more territory. The notion that the Jews, maybe they don't really belong there, maybe they are guilty, maybe it isn't Jewish territory after all. They've shown themselves throughout the last 100 years they're not actually interested in genuine national self-determination because there are many points that you could prove that could demonstrate that, but one of the most obvious ones is the fact that if you study the map of how Israel would look, and I have it here, in 48, had the Arabs won, God forbid, there'd be no Palestinian state. Egypt would have a chunk, Jordan would have a chunk. It's just about hostility to a Jewish state. And so my concern is that anything that feeds this notion of a Palestinian sovereign state is just telling that it's feeding the fantasy, feeding the ideological hatred. I wondered if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, as I said, I think when we started this interview, I actually was a supporter of the two-state solution for many, many years, through most of my adult life, in fact. I should tell you, just in case people think that they're listening to some right-wing, far-right radical, that's not me. If anything, I'm left of centre politically, and I've always believed in trying to accommodate other people's aspirations
Hmm.
politically. So it seemed to me to be logical that we should end up with two states. I no longer use the phrase two-state solution because having looked at the history, having looked at the evidence, it's clear that it's not a solution. Had it been a solution, it would have worked because it's been tried so many times,
Right.
going right back to that agreement between Weizmann and Faisal. It was tried then, it failed. It was tried again in the Peel Commission recommendations of 1937, and it failed. It was tried again in the UN Partition Plan of 1947. It was tried again on numerous occasions, most recently in 2020 by the previous Trump administration,
Sure.
From Peace to Prosperity, I think it was called.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
was accepted by Benjamin Netanyahu, who is demonized today by those who say that he's some kind of mirror image of the jihadists, which is absolute nonsense. So, in other words, it has been tried repeatedly and it has failed. If a proposed solution has been tried repeatedly and it has repeatedly failed, it can't be a solution by definition. So
Yeah.
what is my attitude to this idea of two states? Personally, I would have no problem seeing a Palestinian state established side by side, living in peace with Israel. I would have no problem with that. I don't see it as a solution. I see it as an outcome. It's not a feasible outcome in current circumstances for all the reasons that we've been discussing, um, but it could conceivably be at some point in the future be an outcome of a changed reality. It's interesting that you mentioned the notion of de-radicalizing the Arab world. And in my book, I talk about this, and I say actually that's one of the things that we need to think about. How do we de-radicalize the Arab world and indeed the Muslim world? And ultimately, we're dealing now here with a situation where almost the entire planet has been radicalized and
Mm.
weaponized against Israel, including international organizations like the UN. So, my goodness, this is an enormous challenge if we really are going to go down that road. But in theory, at any rate, it should be conceivable to de-radicalize those people who still harbor this genocidal and politicidal hostility to Israel.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I don't think it's
Absolutely.
realistic. I don't think it's realistic in the short term. But we do have a couple of precedents for this. So when the Second World War ended, we had a problem with Nazi Germany. We had a couple of generations of Germans who had been brainwashed, just as Arab children are brainwashed today. They had been brainwashed to hate Jews and to believe in National Socialism. And the Western allies recognized that something had to be done about that, because although Hitler was gone, he was dead, and the Nazis had surrendered, the whole thing could restart unless Germany was de-radicalized. And indeed, that was done with the help of the Marshall Plan and with huge resources being put into re-educating the German population. Germany today, although it still has its Nazis, there is no comparison between Germany today and Germany of 1945.
Mm.
It succeeded. Something similar happened in Japan. Generations of Japanese children had been reared on the notion of Japanese military expansionism. In order to create a peaceful Japan, that had to be changed. And again, huge resources, mainly from America, it has to be said, were poured into Japan and de radicalized that population. In theory, it could be done. It's amazing that it succeeded, and let's hope that it continues to succeed. Why did it succeed? Because the diagnosis was correct. People recognized the nature of the problem and what had to be done. We're
Mm.
a long, long way from that when it comes to the Middle East. And we still have delusional statements being made about the two-state solution, including from our own prime minister and including from the American president. Now, is that going to change in the future? It may do with the new administration. I'm not so sure about that. I'm talking about the United States. I'm not
Yeah.
so sure about that.
Yeah.
But what we have to be clear about, and we don't need to be, we don't need to adopt a partisan political view about this issue. And we certainly shouldn't fall into the trap of moving in an extremist direction politically. There is no need to do that. We can still adopt a perfectly reasonable, moderate, centrist political line in explaining to people that however much we might be attracted to the idea of a two-state solution, it won't work in current circumstances. And the historical record shows it has never worked in the past. And
Yeah.
therefore, we have to modify the diagnosis. We have to be realistic. It
Yeah.
might go against everything we believe in. It might go against our own political and ideological instincts. But
Yeah.
we have to be realistic. And only
Yeah.
by being realistic, facing that elephant in the room head
Yeah.
on and saying, we've got to get it out of the room, only
Yeah.
then can we make progress
Yeah.
towards what could become a two-state outcome eventually. But we're a long way from that today.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we'll talk a bit about solutions and proposed ideas and all that. And as the final question, I'm a little bit short on time now, so just so two final questions. First question is, I'm curious more from like a scientific and psychological perspective. Do you think people, especially in the Western world, who are so tied to this idea of two-state solution right now, that there really is legitimate grievance driving all of this, and they're so stuck in that mindset, have you seen anything, any tool that can be used to help people see reality, or do you think some people are just so stuck in an ideological prism they can't be helped?
I think the first thing I would say is that we're all products of our environment. And Dave Rich has written about this in his book, Everyday Antisemitism. You know, he says in that book that he's often asked, what is it that makes people, turns people into anti-Semites? What is it that pushes them along a path where they are willing to believe anti-Semitic ideas, even at the relatively soft end of the spectrum? They don't have to be Nazis. But where do they get this from? And he says, actually, when you're talking about Britain, you just need to have been born in this country. That's it. You just need to have been born here and you will grow up with it. You will absorb it passively and even unconsciously. And as a result of that, even some Jews will internalize that anti-Semitic narrative, including the narrative about the Arab-Israeli conflict. And of course, if we look at the mainstream media, we don't. I'm sure your viewers have heard about this in the past. The mainstream media are promoting a narrative. They wouldn't regard themselves as anti-Semitic, but in effect, it's anti-Semitic because of its continuous demonization of Israel, even in defiance of the evidence. So, what can we do about this? Let me just tell you a very brief anecdote about this book. When the book came out, I had a number of launch events, which I discovered were mainly addressing friendly audiences. They were a self-selected audience. They were great. They came to the launches. They were mainly Jewish, not exclusively, but they were mainly Jewish, and they were sympathetic to what I was saying. And I was delighted to see them there. But what I realized was we have to get across this message to non-Jews. We're only, what are we, 0.2% of the world's population. We can't win this argument on our own. We can't get people to look at the evidence, just by appealing to other Jews or Israelis. So how do we do this? Well, I've got some non-Jewish friends, as I'm sure most of your viewers do as well. And what I did was I selected 3 of them that I'd heard making some rather, I would call them distasteful comments about Israel. Unintentionally, they weren't trying to be rude or
Sure.
anti-Semitic, but they made comments about Israel and disproportionality and massacres, things that I knew to be wrong, but they clearly didn't, because they'd been simply absorbing the information from their environment. I gave them each a complimentary copy of the book. About a month later, and this happened just the other day actually, I met them again. We as it happens, we play in chamber. We play chamber music together. That's how I came to meet them again. 2 out of the 3 of them said to me, "This is an amazing book. I'd never heard this information before. I'd never come across the material you've put in this book." And I said, "Well, why should you? Unless you're directly involved, you wouldn't know about it." Interestingly enough, the third one has yet to make a comment, and I'm not holding my breath about that. But so what's the point of this little anecdote? You can influence hearts and minds. Actually, to come back to the 2 who reacted positively, both non-Jews, one of them works in the BBC. He has already had a stand-up argument with a BBC colleague in the BBC canteen about the BBC's reporting. That was very brave of him, actually, about the BBC's reporting of the conflict. He said he would never have in a million years have had an argument of that sort if he hadn't read my book.
Right. But it sounds like people in these cases are people who are not deeply ideologically tied. And I'm wondering about some people, friends of mine even, who are so stuck in an ideological paradigm that it's about legitimate grievance and two-state solution, and Israel has to bear some responsibility for aggression, all that, and no amount of fact from history or from what we're seeing happening recently, or from seeing that there's still widespread support among the Arab population in Gaza and Judea and Samaria for October 7th. To me, from what your answer, that seems to suggest to me that it's the more it's just based, hostility to Israel might just be based on shallow ignorance, the more likely you are to be able to change it. But the more deep-seated the ideological convictions are, the much harder it is. My last question to you, just because I just have a few minutes left, is around solutions. So, of course, you said that we have to deal with de-radicalization. And I just wanted to share with you something that I feel quite strongly and just would welcome your reflections on this. But I think just as important as it is for us to enlighten people to the cause of this conflict, I think if this is the cause of the conflict, it's about hostility towards Jews, particularly in the Arab world. The question is how we deal with the de-radicalization. And I'm not so sure that the only way to do that is by telling them why we shouldn't be hated. Here's how, Jews and how they've been killed throughout the history and how they've been targeted. And that's been the approach of dealing with anti-Semitism to date. Just teach people how much Jews have been killed. And I was having a great chat with a Chabad rabbi actually recently, who was articulating what I've felt for a long time, that we need to also teach the world about Jews and how they live. Not just fight the anti-Semitism, but try and create pro-Semitism. And I've seen that with Arabs who we forget that the Arab world is a deeply religious world, deeply God-centric world. Who introduced this to the world in the first place, if not the Jewish people? And this is something that I think they could gain a lot of. We could gain a lot of respect from them if we started articulating the ideas and the values and and I think that's also should feed into how we discuss our relationship with the land of Israel. Go back to the biblical religious centric stuff that they have so much time and respect for. And I just wondered if you would agree that that's got to be a critical part of the solution and turning the tide from hostility towards warmth between our communities.
So just to pick up on your last point first, and then I'll go back into the earlier part of your question. Sure. I completely agree with that. Of course, Islam emerged from Judaism, and that is historical fact, and as did Christianity. And yep. I remember actually in my school days when there was an outburst of anti-Semitism, and the school was a very traditional conservative Scottish school. There was this outburst of anti-Semitism, and the school chaplain addressed the assembly, and I happened to be there because I was playing in the orchestra. And he was saying, "I need to remind the more self-righteous of you that Jesus himself was a Jew." And a lot of the expressions that, jaws fell to the floor. They'd never heard. They didn't know that. They had no idea. I also know I have worked with a lot of Muslim postgraduate students and some undergraduates, but mainly postgraduates. When they found out, I was concerned when they found out I was Jewish and had connections with Israel, how they would react. And actually, at a personal level, I didn't have any problems with them. And many of them talked very warmly about their families' connections with Jews in the days when there were a lot of Jews in the Arab world. Of course, now there are hardly any. And I thought, wait a minute, there's something odd happening here. There's a disconnect between how I'm relating to these Muslims as individuals and what we're seeing at a kind of geopolitical level. So I think you've touched on a very important insight there. I would urge everybody watching this interview, Jewish or non-Jewish, to try to engage with Muslims at a personal level.
Yeah.
Try and put aside politics just for 20 minutes over a cup of coffee or whatever, a glass of wine, whatever you think is appropriate. Probably not a glass of wine, actually, talking to Muslims, unless it's alcohol free. But
Yeah.
talk to them at a personal level about your identity as a Jew, if you happen to be Jewish, or if you're Christian or whatever. Communicate at that personal level. Talk about the many commonalities. I mean, why did Muhammad create some of the rules around Islam, such as not eating pork, such as the Brit Milah, the circumcision? Why did he do that? Such as monotheism. I mean, Islam is a monotheistic religion because he respected many of the Jewish traditions from which this new, what actually was a branch of Judaism that he was creating. He then got annoyed with the Jews for not accepting this new religion he'd created. But he had huge respect for Jews, and to this day, many Muslims have respect for Judaism as a religion. So that's the first thing I would say is try and put politics aside for the purposes of that 20-minute discussion. Establish a personal relationship and talk about the commonalities from monotheism through to some dietary laws between Judaism and Islam, and I predict you will get a positive, warm response from that conversation.
Yeah.
But to go back to what we can do, I think the first thing is, and this reflects my own experience, we have to educate ourselves, and we have to become self-aware about that elephant in the room, even though we might find it unpleasant. And then we have to have discussions with anybody who will discuss. We don't need to become obsessive about this. We don't need to become political bores about this. But when the topic comes up of Israel and the conflict and what's to happen to the Palestinians, engage with families, engage with our friends in our communities, and help to educate them based on our own self-education and self-awareness. But the other thing we need to do is adopt a very hard-headed approach to those people at the more anti-Semitic end of the spectrum. As you say, the narrative has taken hold, which is largely hostile to Israel. But starting with the more extreme end of the spectrum, we have to call to account those people who are being overtly anti-Semitic. We should no longer let them get away with it, whether it's in the media, whether it's in NGOs like Amnesty, whether it's in the UN, whether it's in UNRWA. We have to call all of these people to account. If they really believe that in anti-racism, and many of them wrap themselves in this cloak of virtue that we're just being anti-racist, that's why we're anti-Zionist. Well, you can't get much more racist than being an anti-Zionist, because anti-Zionism is predicated on the idea that out of all the peoples on earth, only one group is not permitted to self-determination, which is in the UN Charter. And I think we have to call that out, and we haven't been doing that up till now. And there is still this view that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, and those people who say it is are simply trying to shield Israel from criticism, and that is a nonsense. That is a nonsense.
And more positively as well, to not just to say that, how can you say we don't have a right to a self-determination, but also to say that if any people were tied to a specific land, you cannot have a stronger connection than the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Professor David Stone, thank you so much for your time. It's so greatly appreciated. Thank you for writing this book, and viewers, please do get a copy of this book, Antisemitism in the Arab-Israeli Conflict, because it's just full of such important information, and David has done the hard work of getting that information clear so that you're grounded in facts when you have these arguments and these debates. It's so important that we have knowledge. So Professor Stone, thank you for writing the book, for your time, for your insights, and hopefully we can have some more discussions like this in the future.
My pleasure. Thank you, Ollie.
If you've made it so far in this video, I have a request for you. JTV has been having a really big impact in spreading the truth about Israel and creating positive associations with the Jewish people, Judaism, and Israel. We've really grown a lot, particularly in the last year, and we're having a really significant impact, both for Jews and non-Jews. But I really want to take JTV to the next level so we can start to compete with the other big online media beasts that are often peddling anti-Israel content. And the way we're going to do that is to scale even faster. So I'd love to build a team where we have other presenters doing shows like me, let's start doing documentaries, supplementary content, animated content, etc., etc. And to do that, I'd like to build a bit of a team. So what we're going to do is we're going to do one fundraising day, just one, where we try and build up some funding in order to fund such a team. Now, to do that, it's going to obviously require people to get involved. And I'm wondering if you would consider, if you're watching JTV content and appreciate what we do and want to help partner with us in taking this to the next level and spreading the truth farther and wider than ever before, I wonder if you'd consider partnering with us simply by running a mini page on the fundraiser that we do, where you just reach out to your contacts on that day that we choose to fundraise and see if they'll all chip in. If you'd be up for doing that, of which I would be so grateful, then please click on the Google form link in the video description of this video, where you can simply just put in a few contact details. It'll be a very small commitment, as I say, literally just one day that we'll all agree upon as a collective community. But the impact is going to be so big. There's such strength in numbers. If we all pull together and do this, we can take this to the next level. And as I say, all of us can partner together in bringing and spreading the truth to the whole world. So please do consider clicking on that link, filling in the form, and I'll be in touch very soon to talk about the next steps. Small commitment, but a big impact. Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.